Do you know what months are the busiest on the labor unit? These ones, the end of summer, early fall, before the holidays months. I'm not going to lie, working on the OB unit in these months was wild, just as much as it was so much fun. But what I saw over and over again was that these busier seasons often meant your providers had less time. Less time to teach you, less time to educate you about pros and cons, and often less time to give you to make your own decisions. I want to make sure that this doesn't happen to you, and it won't once you join me inside of the Your Body, Your Birth class. An online course created by me, a mama, former labor and mom-baby nurse, and CLC. The video and audio inside this class will take you from overwhelmed, worried, and unsure to prepared, informed, and excited, and ready to chase the birth you want, regardless of how busy your provider or that OB unit might be. To get started right now and save 25% for being a podcast listener, head over to thelabormama.com/birth and use the code MAMA25 to join me for as little as $65 today. The link and your coupon code are in the show notes.
Motherhood is all-consuming.
Having babies, nursing, feeling the fear of loving someone that much.
And there's this baby on your chest and boom, your entire life has changed.
It's a privilege of being your child's safest space and watching your heart walk around outside of your body.
The truth is, I can be having the best time being a mum 1 minute, and then the next I'm questioning all my life choices.
I'm Lo Mansfield, your host of the Lo and Behold podcast. Mama of 4 littles, former labor and postpartum RN, CLC, and your new best friend in the messy middle space of all the choices you are making in pregnancy, birth, and motherhood. If there is one thing I know after years of delivering babies at the bedside and then having and now raising those 4 of my own, it is that there is no such thing as a best way to do any of this. And we're leaning into that truth here. With a mix of real life and what the textbook says, expert insights, and practical applications, each week we're making our way towards stories that we participate in, stories that we are honest about, and stories that are ours. This is the Lo and Behold podcast. All right, you guys, get ready for it. Today, we are talking about the cervix and the cervical exam. And before you run away going, yeah, not interested in this, I just want to say, hang on a second. This conversation actually is surprisingly interesting. I always feel like such a dork because I say like, I love talking about the cervix because it just does a lot of things and it's actually really valuable to understand and know. But the conversation, even like collectively or socially in the birth world, I think has become really interesting. And so I wanted to get in here and have a quick conversation. Like this is not going to be a 45-minute episode about the cervix. I want this to be a quick hit bite of education for you because I think that this information is super important. And I want to be able to keep sending you back to this and saying, hey, if someone has some sort of convo online or on Instagram about what you should and shouldn't do in this regard, here's this podcast. Here's this podcast can remind you of what is and isn't true. And ultimately like that you get to decide about all this. Okay, so the conversation socially, collectively, however you want to say that, on Instagram, I've been in this conversation for a long time, right? Because like I just told you, I like talking about the cervix, which means I'm in this conversation. But years ago, I had kind of my most viral reel up to that point of being on social media. And I think it got like 5 or 6 million views back at a time when it was kind of a really big deal to get millions and millions of views. And it was about this topic. And my reel was about having a 37-week cervical exam and essentially saying like, who's still telling us that we have to do this? Like, you don't have to do this. And the reel, as they do when they go viral, was just flooded with comments who are for these cervical exams, who are against these cervical exams, who felt like their cervical exam actually helped like save, if you will, their labor because they needed it for XYZ reason. There were people talking about cervical exams being abusive, informed consent, uninformed consent. The comments were all over the place. And that's to be expected when something goes viral. But I also think it shows that this conversation is maybe like more interesting than it appears at the surface, and that there is something to be said in all of this. And what I think that needs to be said, and I'll just tell you right now, this end game for this episode, you can hear this and you can walk away, is that you understand that cervical exams are a choice. But I think that the environment that we're in, this birthy world that we're in, is kind of yelling a lot of, you can say no, you can say no, say no, say no. And we've forgotten to also say that you can say yes, that this is your choice, that you should know what a cervical exam is, what it tells you, what it doesn't tell you, what the pros and cons are, and then you can say yes or no. So that's the end goal. That's where we're going to land this plane, is that you walk away and you go, okay, now I have my own information to make my own decision, regardless of social media and all the educators yelling at me to deny them or telling me to say yes, because that's what my provider wants me to do. Like, you can fall anywhere you want on this spectrum. You get to choose. All right. So one of the first things that I really just want to do at a basic level, and this might sound silly because maybe you're saying, are you kidding me right now? But is just define what's the cervix? Like, why does it matter? And if it's your first baby, you may have no idea. I don't think any of us think about our cervix until we are going through childbirth, right? And so if that's you, really quickly, the cervix is the lower portion of the uterus. The uterus is like the big organ that your baby grows inside of and gets huge and fills your belly. And the uterus contracts and pushes down. When we're in labor, it pushes, like, the force from the uterus pushes baby down and through the body. And when the baby is leaving the uterus, they go through the cervix. You might hear someone call the cervix the neck of the uterus. You probably won't ever hear that term, but just in case, it's kind of like the neck, if that helps you kind of visualize it better in your head right now. The cervix exits into the vagina, also called the birth canal, especially when we're talking about the birth process. And it's kind of sandwiched between the bladder and front, which feels very tiny when you're pregnant and needs to be emptied every 12 seconds. And then the rectum behind. So the cervix kind of sits down there at the exit point for all of this stuff. The cervix itself, and this is where childbirth, we get so specific with the cervix, makes a ton of change before a baby is born. So we have dilation and effacement. It opens, it thins, and then the cervix actually moves where it's at in your own body through your labor. It changes, its consistency changes, and then the station of your baby changes within your pelvis. And we check on that during a cervical exam too. So the station isn't really specifically related to your cervix, but it gets checked on during this exam. And so those are the 5 things: dilation, effacement, position, consistency, and station, that all are getting checked on if someone were to have a cervical exam during labor. All of those things have to change in some way for your baby to be born vaginally. So they all have value. This conversation matters. And that is why a cervical exam then becomes part of the labor, birth, pregnancy conversation as well. One thing I will also mention to you related to the cervix is that in general, during pregnancy, it should be thick and it should be long. And I'm saying long because effacement measures its thinness, and it eventually thins out and totally disappears. But we want it to be thick and closed in a certain length. There's a range of a cervical length. But if we were to see a cervix opening or getting the thickness kind of shortening too soon, that can start to be a concern for preterm labor or preterm birth. So typically we're not checking on that. The expectation is just that all of this stuff works. But if you have a history of preterm labor or some indication that your cervix might be thinning or shortening too soon, that is something that we're going to be paying attention to. So it's not really part of the cervical check conversation I'm having with you right now. We're talking about more the ones at the end of pregnancy during labor where we want to see the cervix making change. But in general, the cervix, we want it to be a certain way for the first, let's say, 8-ish months or something. And then we expect to see change. And if something's changing earlier, that's going to be checked on by your care team. It's kind of a different conversation. You're not necessarily going to say no to someone checking on a cervix at 5 months because there's signs that it might be shortening or funneling or something like that. That's also going to be done via ultrasound or in other ways and by other means. So separate combo, but relevant in general to how we want the cervix to be, and then essentially what we want it to do later on at the right time, if you will. Okay, so what's a cervical exam? That's all about the cervix, what it can do. The cervical exam is the opportunity for someone to actually check the cervix and see if it's doing any of those things that we just talked about. Is it changing? Is it moving? What is going on in there? Typically, a cervical exam is offered around 37 weeks. That's going to be the first time you're offered. And this is a manual exam done by a provider. It can be doctor, midwife, it can be a nurse, typically in your prenatal appointments, because that's when they're first typically offered. It's going to be done by your provider. So probably your doctor or your midwife. But it's a sterile procedure, which sounds like a little dramatic, but just meaning put on a sterile glove, you lay down, and then they go ahead and they check your cervix and see what they can feel. I will say just like tips for having one done. If you are able to, which not all of us are at 9-10 months pregnant, if you can kind of like put your feet together and let your knees fall open, that's kind of an easier position for them to reach the cervix and get to it. And then if you can prop anything kind of under, like top of your bottom base of your spine, that kind of can like lift your pelvis and your hips up off of like the table or wherever you are a little bit, that can often help a provider get to the cervix as well. So like a bedpan, we use those a lot more in the hospital. We have those laying around, a rolled up towel, something like that. I have heard and actually have made the suggestion myself that you can like put your hands in a fist behind your back and lift as well. Lift your pelvis and kind of your bottom up that way. For a lot of people, that is a very vulnerable position because it's like your hands are trapped and you're being checked on as well. So that wouldn't be my first suggestion, but it is another way to kind of lift your pelvis up a little bit for those exams. So if you feel comfortable doing that, that's an option as well. So prenatally is when these are typically first offered 37 weeks, 38, 39, certainly as you get closer. And then these are offered during labor, or they are part of the labor process. And then cervical exams are often part of the triage process. So that could be part of your labor process. But if you were to go in, I don't know, at 40 weeks for a labor check because you've been contracting for 8 hours at home, that's often going to be part of the process. Hey, we'd like to check your cervix, see if you're dilated at all. If you definitely are, hey, they're going to keep you. And if you're not, maybe they have you walk, do some things around the unit and want to check you like 2 hours later. And the reason for that, especially in OB triage and in labor, is that when we see the cervix changing over time, that's a pretty good indication that someone is in labor or things are changing. So if we check the cervix and just have like a singular check at one moment in time, it doesn't tell us a ton. So like if we check it at your 37-week appointment, find out you're dilated, and that's that, it tells us that you're dilated at that moment, but it doesn't really tell us where you'll be an hour later, a week later, or a month later. Whereas if you kind of have the two, more like this triage process that I just mentioned, check once and then check again a couple hours later, and we see change, that's a little bit better picture of, okay, there is something happening right now. When it comes to who performs it, I mentioned already that it can be provider or nurse. I think it's nice for you to know that often in the hospital, it is going to be your nurse more often than your provider. This can depend on who your provider is or their relationship with the patients, how much they get to be on the floor versus in the office, all of that. But most often where I practice is that the nurses do a ton of these, and then they can call and relay what's going on to the provider and let them know. And then if it changes their decisions, changes plan of care, then the nurse can go ahead and take care of whatever comes next after relaying that information to your provider. So definitely expect nurses to be very involved in the cervical exam process when you're at the hospital or you're in triage. Okay, so let's go back to those 5 things I mentioned that can be looked at during the cervical exam. If you remember, that was dilation, effacement, position, consistency, and station. So dilation is the one that gets all the fanfare, right? We're going 0 to 10 centimeters. We want the cervix fully open for the baby to come out and through. Everyone wants to know, am I dilated? Am I dilated? Am I dilated? The 0 might also be referred to as closed. So if someone were to say like you're closed, thick, and high, that means your cervix is closed, your cervix is not effaced. And then high would mean the station of your baby is really high, which is like, again, kind of going back to the earlier conversation, it's what we want to see in earlier pregnancy when we don't want that cervix doing anything. We want you to be closed, thick, and high. And then conversely, if someone's like, yay, they're complete, that means you're 10 centimeters dilated, you're 100% effaced, that cervix is gone. That's kind of that opposite end of the spectrum. Now, effacement, that vocabulary I just mentioned, is a percentage number. And so it's about the thickness or that length of the cervix as it kind of like thins out, and then the length kind of disappears as well. It thins and kind of then pulls like up around the baby's head, if you will. And the effacement is a percentage number that goes between 0 and 100. So when you're 0% effaced, your cervix is fully thick. That's like how we would want you to be at 6 months pregnant. And when you're 100% effaced, the cervix is totally thin and gone. So if you're 10 centimeters and 100% effaced, cervix is gone, which is great, right? For having a baby anyway. And then the next one is position. And so this is where the cervix is at in the maternal body. So it can be posterior, which is like way more towards the back, mid position, or anterior, which is like right up at the front, like very easy for a provider to check, because when they go ahead and check you, it's just right there. They don't have to kind of like reach behind, or I'm going to use the quote, like go get the cervix, which it can feel like that in earlier cervical checks, or maybe like a 37-week one, or the one at the start of an induction. Often that position of the cervix can be really far back in your body. It hasn't rolled forward yet. And the provider, it can feel like they have to like really reach for it and go get to it, which yes, can be uncomfortable for you. So good to know that sometimes those earlier exams can feel that way. And then a later exam, if you were to have one or wanted to have one, that later exam might feel a little bit easier. Okay, consistency is the firmness or the softness of the cervix. So just kind of like, how does it feel to the provider? And then the station, I mentioned this briefly, it's not actually about the cervix. It's about where the baby's head is at in relation to your pelvis. And those numbers go from about like -3, -4 to 0, which is like kind of the middle through the pelvis. And then +1, +2, +3 is the baby's coming like down and coming out when we get to like the +3 number. And so that's that last kind of portion of the cervical exam. And when you hear the numbers together, this is typical. You'll hear like she's 2 centimeters, 50% effaced, and -3 station. That's that station at the end. So it's 2 centimeters dilated. Effaced is that middle number. Station is the third one. And then you rarely are going to hear them report about the position or the consistency, but I want you to be aware that those are being checked as well, and that they're all part of the cervical exam and can be used to make choices. That kind of brings me to the last little thing about all these numbers for me, is that question of what numbers matter the most. And I would say that you can't answer that question, or that I won't tell you that one thing matters more than the others. And that is because progress, when we're talking about labor, progress can be measured in a lot of ways. And I already told you dilation gets like all of the fanfare, right? How dilated are you? How dilated are you? And then I would say effacement is the next big thing. Like, are you dilated? Are you effaced? But all of these other things can indicate that progress is being made, even if dilation hasn't changed. And I like you to hear that and know that. So just like, put that away, that progress can be indicated if baby has come down a station and the cervix is soft and it wasn't prior. Like those can be signs, hey, something's happening in there, even if we don't see the big, 2 or 3 centimeter change that we were hopeful for. So just remember that progress is not about one of these solitary numbers, and that number is the most important. It can be about all of this collectively, or it can be, progress can be indicated by change in just one of these as well. And in that moment, well, then that number matters the most, right? Because it showed you some change. And so that answer of what is the most important, I just don't know that there's an answer to that, or you have to say all of them at any different time, like an it depends type answer. All right, last thing is putting all these numbers together. I won't go too much in the weeds with this, because we get into all of these numbers and how to use them, like you use them to make choices inside of your body, your birth. But the Bishop score is a tool that we can use where we give a score to each of those 5 things that we just talked about. And that score, we add those scores together, and the score that we then get like cumulatively can tell us how ripe or favorable your cervix is for induction. And so this becomes incredibly valuable to know all of these numbers, to know this cumulative score when we're talking about introducing Pitocin. And Pitocin is used like anywhere between like 30 and 50% of labors, depending on what like research or evidence you're looking at. And so that means we need to have good information before we're saying yes to Pitocin. Pitocin, I feel pretty comfortable saying, is overused, but certainly I want you to know that the Bishop score can be part of how you and your team together are deciding, should we go ahead and use Pitocin? Is my body ready to introduce or add Pitocin into my labor? And this bishop score is part of answering that question. The last thing I would say that I want you to hear with that is it's not your job to tell your provider, hey, don't forget to check my bishop score. Like, they should be doing it. They are doing it. But if you want to be a part of that conversation, you should be. And if you know these numbers and you know what they mean, it's going to help you have a really good convo in that. I think it's time to start Pitocin conversation if that comes up or whatever that looks like for you. And you can say, will you share with me what my bishop score is? How do you feel about it? Does that make you feel good about adding PIT right now? Does that make me unfavorable? And should we try something else? Like, it's just going to make you a lot more educated to have a really good conversation if that were to come up in your labor. The conversation of, I think, Pitocin and like introducing interventions, I think helps us decide to, or leads us to the part of the conversation here that I wanted to get to really, which is like, so do you say yes or no? Because that's what we're hearing on either side, right? Is like, is the cervical exam something I should or shouldn't do? Or sometimes everyone seems like is just telling you, stop doing them, right? And so to answer that question, we need to understand the pros and cons, right? Like, what is it telling you? And what could it potentially do? Like, what are the cons or possible considerations there? And how do you weigh those two things? And before we get into specific pros and cons, I know I've kind of like hinted at this, but I want to reiterate that the cervical exam itself doesn't tell us a lot. It tells us what's going on in that specific moment in time. And if we were to have a prior exam to compare against, that can tell us what has happened like between those two things, right? And so it can indicate progress or change. And sometimes we need to know that information. But I think it's important to remember as you work through pros and cons is that the cervix is not a crystal ball, right? And so it doesn't, like, if you leave your 38-week appointment and you're 3 centimeters dilated, it doesn't really tell you anything. It doesn't tell you your baby is or isn't coming. It doesn't tell you you should or shouldn't go on that overnight trip, or whether your partner like should or shouldn't go on their work trip. It just tells you when your provider checked you that afternoon, you were 3 centimeters. And so that can be anxiety producing for some. It can give people peace. That's why I think you kind of get to decide some of this, but just know that it doesn't tell you anything beyond what you get to know, like in that moment. The other thing I think it's helpful to know is that the cervix can change really, really quickly. So a lot of times people do get checked. They want to know, and then they're super discouraged because it turns out they're 1 centimeter and they're 41 weeks and they were hoping they were 3 or something like that. And I just want you to hear that it also changes really fast. So I told you it's not a crystal ball, and that applies to, am I definitely going into labor or am I not? Or is it going to be quick or soon? Like, it doesn't tell us any of that. One of my best friends goes from like 0 to 10. She's done it 3 times in hours, even her first baby. They did not want to admit her at the hospital, which I have to say, I understand as a nurse who's been there, because she was 1 centimeter when she got there and had her baby. I mean, in my head, I'm like, thank goodness they kept her, or she convinced them, or they were looking at other signs of labor in her, because her dilation was not telling them the full story. And she had her baby like an hour later. Such a fast labor. So it just doesn't really tell us a lot. And so make sure you hold that knowledge close as you decide, do I want to get checked? I do, or I don't want to get checked, that you can't use it. Try not to pin like a lot of hope or anxiety on it, especially in these, 38, 39, 40 weeks where it can change, but it might not. That's all normal, if you will. Okay, so pros, if we're going to hold that and remember all of that, one of the biggest reasons that you might want to say yes is because you just want to know. And I just told you, if this is going to cause you angst, like maybe that's a reason to not choose it. If it's going to give you a lot of peace, just remember that it doesn't fully tell you everything, but wanting to know is valid. So if you are 38 weeks pregnant and you are dying to know if you are dilated, then you can say yes to it with joy and informed consent, because that's what you want to do. And I just want you guys to hear that, because I feel like people invalidate that as reason. But if you know the pros and cons and then you're saying, yes, please, that's a great reason to do it. Another reason, we've talked about this a little bit with the bishop score, is if finding out what the cervix is at whatever moment in time, if knowing that will change your plan of care sometimes. And sometimes it will. This might be because of progress. It might be because there's something going on with baby. And if you're close to delivery, maybe we can just go ahead and push instead of C-section. Like, there are decisions like that where a quick cervical check in that moment might actually help you make a decision for A or B, or yes or no. And so that can be a time to say yes as well. We talked about the Bishop score, introducing Pitocin. That's another time where a cervical exam has a lot of value for a labor process. So that's another reason, or a pro where someone might say, yep, this is something I need right now. I think another one is just, this is going to kind of like big umbrella, but if there's a medical reason to be in there looking, and I mentioned this at the beginning of, we want the cervix to be long and thick and earlier in your pregnancy. So if there's an indication it's not, we want to pay attention. If there's another medical reason to be in there, there are other reasons where we might want to say, like, what's going on in there? Is this labor? Is it not? Is it preterm labor? Like, those might be reasons to check as well. And so that's another reason that someone might be saying, yes, please, like, I want to know. This information will help me and my team make a decision and choice about what we should do next. And then another kind of last one I would say is that knowing an exam, having an exam can establish a baseline. And sometimes that can be valuable if that baseline is needed to know what's coming next. Maybe that baseline is needed in triage, and otherwise they aren't going to keep you because you're exhibiting or they see no other signs of labor. And maybe the baseline becomes valuable so they can compare. Maybe the baseline is needed because progress isn't happening, and they're going to say, we have failure to progress unless there's a cervical exam, and they can say, actually, wait, there's been progress. There are times where that might be the tool that is needed to indicate what is or isn't going on. Now, I think that can be used too often and sometimes used almost like weaponized, but I also think it's very important to say there are certainly times where that is the tool that's needed to kind of maybe keep moving your labor process forward. Okay, that gets us into the cons, though, or the considerations we want to have in this regard, which obviously there's two sides to this coin, right? And it's why a lot of people, I think, are saying, you can say no, you can say no. It's because there are cons. So it's helpful that people know them, because otherwise they may have been having them in years past and not realizing, like, oh, I can say no, and there's reasons I might want to say no. So one of those, we've already talked about it, is that they can be uncomfortable. And that's enough reason for a lot of people to say, like, I don't want one. And I know I mentioned this a little bit, but they can be more uncomfortable earlier in pregnancy or earlier in labor. So you might find, like, I don't really want one now, and then you're 9 centimeters and it's actually not going to be that uncomfortable at all because the cervix is right there and you're close, and for whatever reason you want to know. And so the comfort level may change, and your decision-making process about that could change when we're talking specifically about that being a con to getting one. The other thing is that they can increase anxiety or cause worry. So I've already told you in multiple ways that these don't tell us what's going on. And so if knowing those numbers are going to make you worry, fearful, sad, anxious, and otherwise, like, you don't need to know, then that could be a reason to say, I don't want to know because I'm just going to be so bummed if I'm 1 centimeter, or the reverse of, I don't want to know because if I'm dilated and I thought I wouldn't be, it makes me feel so nervous tonight. You can decide based on, like, will that be a con to know this value? How will it impact me? So that's going to be part of the process for a lot of people. Like we've already said, they're not always predictive. They don't guarantee anything. So to use that as a pro, sometimes it's like, well, let's find out what you are, and that'll help us know when this baby's coming. That's not true. And so if that language or vocabulary is being used, it's not true. It certainly doesn't mean you have to say no, but just know that is a consideration in this conversation too. And then there's a risk of infection. We have to say that just each time we introduce a cervical exam, especially if your waters were broken and we're talking about more in labor, the risk of infection is present and can increase each time we go in there. And then I would say risk of water breaking. It's small, but I've actually seen it happen. And I still remember the provider coming out and saying her water just broke, and she had been checking someone in triage and the water broke, which then means they're staying and it's time to have a baby. And in most instances, that's not really what we want, right? Because that was not a body that was in labor, and it accidentally then water broken, and it means here we go, right? And so that is a risk. It's a small risk. It does not happen that very often, but it is possible. So I think you need to know that as well. Okay, really quickly, if you are someone saying all of this means, like, yeah, I don't want one, but what do I do instead? Or, like, what are the alternatives? I think a big thing here is going to be about the care team and the people around you, but there are other ways to know and see labor progress. Obviously, we can look at contraction pattern, like if you're in the hospital, and be paying attention to that, watching your body cues, looking at fetal activity. If you were on the monitor, sometimes we can see things that indicate, like, baby might be really low in station. Like there's probably some dilation and progress being made. Emotional signposts is a big one. I love those. I talk about those a lot. And you can listen to my episode on emotional signposts as well for more on what I mean by that. But all of those things can be used to look at someone and make are they in labor decision without only saying, I got to check your cervix. That's the only way I know. So ideally, the care team is one that is utilizing all those tools, especially if you're saying, I really don't want my cervix checked right now. They can look at and assess these other things and make smart decisions with you and for you. And then I would say, talk to your providers about this prenatally too, particularly if you're thinking, I just don't want this, and just have those combos about, I don't want one in triage, or like if I come in labor, is there something, I suggest telling the triage nurse, or can we give you a call first? Just kind of feeling that out of what the process will look like, not just your provider's opinion on it, but also like how it will go at the hospital that you're going to have your baby at, and how things like that might be received, and see if your provider can give you some good feedback about how to navigate that, because they're familiar with nurses and triage at these facilities that you're going to have babe at, and you are not, right? So you can feel so good with your delivering provider, but then the nurse in triage is going to be someone you've never met. And so I would hate for you to get there and think, my provider's on board with everything that we've chatted about, but now this new person isn't. And so sometimes prenatally having those conversations can help you figure out what it'll look like when you do get to the hospital to have baby, if that's where you're going. All right, you guys, big takeaways as we kind of wrap this up here is, I don't need to go back through all of this. I think you got these short snippets. Cervical exams are optional. These numbers are tools. They don't tell us everything, but at times they tell us something. Multiple parts of the cervical exam matter. It's not just dilation, although that one is really fun to see change. You can trust your body. You can trust the timeline that your body is establishing when we talk about cervical exam and progress and how the two go together. And then I think that I really want you to hear is that being informed in all of this will help you then decide that you can be the person who says yes, that you can be the person who says no, you can be the person who changes their mind anywhere in between. So if you feel like all the inputs are saying, you need to be denying this, you need to be denying this, or the flip is everyone's saying, like, stop saying no all the time, because what's the big deal? That I want you to hear there's just all that gray space in the middle. And the biggest thing, going back to that very first point I told you when we first got started, is that you get to decide. And whatever you decide, that is your choice, and that is your right. And there is not a right and there's not a wrong. This is just about you being a part of all of this.
Thank you so much for listening to the Lo and Behold podcast. I hope there was something for you in today's episode that made you think, made you laugh, or made you feel seen. For show notes and links to the resources, freebies, or discount codes mentioned in this episode, please head over to loandbeholdpodcast.com. If you aren't following along yet, make sure to tap subscribe or follow in your podcast app so we can keep hanging out together. And if you haven't heard it yet today, you're doing a really good job. A little reminder for you before you go. Opinions shared by guests of this show are their own and do not always reflect those of myself and the Labor Mama platform. Additionally, the information you hear on this podcast or that you receive via any linked resources should not be considered medical advice. Please see our full disclaimer at the link in your show notes.